The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors of the county courthouse in Cleveland, Ohio. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the autumn chill had begun to seep into the building, despite the central heating system working overtime. The hallways were bustling with lawyers in sharp suits, families huddled together in quiet corners, and court officers maintaining the solemn atmosphere that courthouse protocol demanded. But in courtroom 7B, a different kind of tension hung in the air, one that was personal, raw, and deeply painful. 3-year-old Emma Davis sat in an oversized wooden chair, her feet dangling uselessly above the ground. She wore a pink dress with small white flowers, purchased specifically for this day by her mother. The dress was expensive, carefully selected to make Emma look innocent and vulnerable, something her attorney had specifically advised. Emma clutched a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest, an object she'd had since infancy. The rabbit, named Mr. Floppy, had become her emotional anchor during the tumultuous past 8 months. Whenever Emma felt scared or confused, she would squeeze Mr. Floppy, as if the toy could absorb her fear and anxiety. This morning, she was squeezing it so hard her tiny knuckles had turned white. Sarah Mitchell, Emma's mother, sat beside her daughter with her hand placed protectively on Emma's small shoulder. Sarah was 32 years old but looked 10 years older that morning. Dark circles under her eyes told stories of countless sleepless nights. Her hair, usually meticulously styled, was pulled back into a simple ponytail. She wore a conservative dark blue dress suit that her lawyer had recommended, clothes designed to project competence and stability. But beneath the professional appearance, Sarah was falling apart. Her hands trembled slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep them steady. She had already been through so much: the shocking discovery of her husband's infidelities, the painful separation, and the subsequent custody battle that had become increasingly contentious. Across the courtroom, sitting at the opposing counsel table, was Daniel Davis, Emma's father. He was 41 years old with dark hair graying at the temples, and he wore an expensive charcoal suit with a silk tie. On the surface, Daniel appeared calm and composed, but Sarah knew better. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed rhythmically on the table, a nervous habit he'd always had. Beside Daniel sat his attorney, Richard, a high-powered lawyer known for winning custody cases through aggressive cross-examination and character assassination. Was in his 60s, with silver hair and a reputation for being ruthless. He leaned toward Daniel continuously, whispering urgent instructions, occasionally glancing nervously at the judge. Sarah wondered what was telling him. What strategy were they employing today? Judge sat elevated at the bench, her black robes lending her an air of absolute authority. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Judge had been on the bench for nearly 20 years and had presided over hundreds of custody cases. She was known for being fair but uncompromising, for carefully weighing evidence and testimony against the best interests of the child. On her desk lay the case file, a thick folder containing 8 months of legal documents, social worker reports, psychological evaluations, and contradictory testimony from both parents and their respective witnesses. The judge had spent the previous evening reviewing every page, making notes in the margins, preparing for this critical decision. Behind them, scattered throughout the wooden benches, sat various court personnel and observers. Social workers from the Ohio Department of Children and Family Services sat with grave expressions. These professionals had interviewed Emma multiple times, visited both homes, and prepared detailed reports about the living conditions and parental fitness. On one side sat Sarah's family, her mother, her sister, and her best friend. They offered silent moral support, their presence a reminder that Sarah was not alone in this battle. On Daniel's side sat his parents and a few friends, all wearing expressions of concerned solidarity. The courtroom itself was quintessentially judicial, wood paneling on the walls, a suspended seal of the state of Ohio above the judge's bench, and an American flag standing proudly in the corner. The air smelled of old wood and furniture polish, mixed with the faint scent of anxiety that seemed to emanate from everyone in the room. The overhead lights hummed softly, creating a gentle background noise that paradoxically made the silence feel even heavier. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, swinging her legs slightly. She didn't fully understand what was happening. She was too young to comprehend the legal complexities of custody disputes, too innocent to grasp the implications of her parents' separation. All she knew was that Mommy and Daddy didn't live together anymore, that she had 2 bedrooms in 2 different houses, and that grown-ups often looked sad when they looked at her. The stuffed rabbit was her only constant, her only reliable source of comfort in a world that had become confusing and frightening. The case had been brutal and contentious from the very beginning. The initial separation had been precipitated by Sarah discovering extensive evidence of Daniel's infidelity. She had found text messages, dating app accounts, and hotel receipts. The discovery had shattered her world. When she confronted Daniel, he had become defensive and aggressive, minimizing his actions and blaming Sarah for being too focused on her career as a graphic designer to pay attention to his emotional needs. The argument had escalated into a screaming match, and Daniel had moved out the next day. What had begun as a marital crisis had evolved into a custody war. Over the following months, the situation had deteriorated. Sarah had filed for custody, expressing concerns about Daniel's character and his ability to be a responsible parent. Daniel had countered with his own concerns, suggesting that Sarah was attempting to alienate him from his daughter, and that her own career ambitions made her an unfit mother. Both parties had hired expensive attorneys. Both had psychological evaluations. Both had submitted to home visits. The social services reports were mixed, some passages favorable to Sarah, others suggesting Daniel could also be a capable parent. But there were other concerns, issues that lay beneath the surface of this custody dispute. Issues that Sarah harbored deep anxiety about, issues that she had tried to raise with her attorney multiple times, but that seemed difficult to prove or articulate. Strange behavior changes in Emma, reluctance to visit her father, vague statements that a 3-year-old couldn't quite explain. Sarah's attorney had advised her to focus on concrete evidence rather than speculative concerns. "The judge needs facts," he had said. "Accusations without evidence will only make you look desperate." Judge cleared her throat, preparing to begin the proceedings. The bailiff called the court to order. Sarah squeezed Emma's shoulder gently, whispering words of reassurance that she herself didn't entirely believe. Emma looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes, silently asking a question she couldn't quite formulate. What was going to happen? Would everything be okay? Would Mommy still be there tomorrow? Nobody in that courtroom could have anticipated what was about to happen. Nobody could have predicted that within the next hour, everything would change irrevocably. Nobody could have imagined that a 3-year-old child would become the unlikely hero of a story far darker and more sinister than anyone had suspected. The tension in the room was about to transform from custody battle anxiety into something far more grave, far more urgent, and far more consequential than anyone could have foreseen. The judge opened the case file and began to speak. Judge had been speaking for approximately 15 minutes, her measured tone reviewing the case facts and establishing the framework for her decision. She discussed Sarah's employment history, Daniel's financial stability, and the social worker's reports in careful, deliberate language. The judge was methodical, thorough, and seemingly leaning toward a shared custody arrangement with primary custody granted to Sarah. Sarah felt a glimmer of cautious hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Her attorney, sitting beside her, had leaned over and whispered, "This is going well. The judge seems sympathetic to your position." Daniel's face had grown increasingly flushed as the judge spoke. His attorney, Richard, was making urgent notes on his legal pad, his jaw clenched tightly. Sarah could see the frustration radiating from Daniel. He clearly believed he deserved more custody time, more control, more influence over Emma's future. Sarah wondered what was going through his mind. Was he angry, defensive, already planning his next legal maneuver. Emma had grown increasingly restless during the proceedings. She didn't understand the words being spoken, didn't comprehend the gravity of the decisions being made. She had begun to fidget with Mr. Floppy, pulling at the rabbit's ears and shifting position repeatedly. Sarah had gently whispered reminders to sit still, but Emma's 3-year-old attention span was reaching its limit. The air in the courtroom felt heavy and suffocating. Judge was just beginning to discuss visitation schedules when something unexpected happened. The courtroom door, which had been closed and relatively silent, suddenly burst open with considerable force. Everyone in the room jumped at the sudden intrusion. The bailiff, an older man named Officer, immediately moved toward the door, prepared to enforce courtroom decorum. But he stopped when he saw who was entering. Officer James Martinez stepped through the doorway with confident authority. He was in his early 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. His police uniform was immaculate, pressed blue shirt, polished badge, belt lined with equipment. But it was his companion that captured the immediate and undivided attention of everyone in the courtroom. Duke was a magnificent German shepherd, approximately 80 pounds of muscle and intelligence. His coat was a beautiful combination of black and tan, meticulously groomed. His ears were alert and upright, constantly scanning the environment. His dark eyes reflected intelligence and training. The dog walked with perfect posture, his movements controlled and precise, every step demonstrating years of professional training. Even for those unfamiliar with police dogs, Duke's presence commanded respect. This was clearly no ordinary pet. This was a working animal, a professional, a tool of law enforcement. The courtroom erupted into confused murmuring. Lawyers leaned toward each other, whispering urgent questions. The social workers exchanged glances of bewilderment. Sarah's mother gasped quietly. Daniel's face went pale. The color literally drained from his complexion, leaving him looking ghostly and profoundly unsettled. His attorney immediately grabbed his arm, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Judge, accustomed to maintaining order and decorum in her courtroom, looked up sharply. She was not pleased by the interruption. Officer Martinez, this is highly irregular. I don't recall scheduling any police presence for this custody hearing. Bailiff, what is the meaning of this? Officer Martinez approached the bench with respect, Duke walking beside him in perfect formation. His demeanor was professional and apologetic. Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for the interruption. I have a warrant for a search and seizure related to evidence in Mr. Daniel Davis's possession. The warrant was issued this morning by Judge Frederick Harrison in response to an ongoing criminal investigation. I'm required to execute it immediately. The words hung in the courtroom like a bomb that had just detonated. Immediate, shocked silence followed. Then chaos erupted. Daniel's attorney jumped to his feet, shouting objections. Daniel himself tried to stand, but his legs seemed to buckle beneath him and he collapsed back into his chair. Sarah felt her heart begin racing at an unprecedented speed. A criminal investigation. What kind of criminal investigation? Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more alarming than the last. What criminal investigation? Judge demanded, her voice cutting through the noise with judicial authority. Mister, sit down. Officer Martinez, explain yourself immediately. Officer Martinez remained calm and composed. He held up official-looking documents, which the bailiff collected and delivered to the judge. Judge's expression grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the warrant. Her eyes widened slightly, a reaction that suggested the warrant contained information that was both shocking and significant. This appears to be in order, Judge said slowly, her voice now carrying an undertone of concern. Officer Martinez, what is the nature of the evidence you're seeking? Officer Martinez hesitated for just a moment, clearly aware of the sensitive nature of what he was about to reveal in a courtroom with a 3-year-old child present. Your Honor, I'm investigating potential violations related to child exploitation material. Our investigation has led us to believe that Mr. Davis may be in possession of such materials, potentially stored here or at his residence. The words seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Sarah felt her legs go weak. Child exploitation material, what did that mean exactly? The implications were horrifying and incomprehensible. She looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign that this was a terrible mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. But what she saw instead was terror, pure, undeniable terror. Daniel's hands were shaking visibly. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead. His mouth opened and closed silently, as if he wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Emma, sensing the sudden shift in the emotional atmosphere of the room, began to whimper. Children are remarkably intuitive. They can sense fear and tension even when they don't understand its source. Emma clutched Mr. Floppy even, looking up at her mother with confused, frightened eyes. "Mommy," she said quietly. "Mommy, what's happening?" Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her close. Tears were beginning to form in her own eyes. Deep down, beneath the surface of her conscious mind, somewhere in the place where mothers possess intuitive knowledge about their children, Sarah had suspected something was terribly wrong. The way Emma had sometimes flinched when her father tried to hug her. The reluctance to go with Daniel for visitations. The vague, confused statements Emma would occasionally make that Sarah couldn't quite understand or articulate. All of it suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. Richard was on his feet again, now not shouting but speaking in rapid, desperate tones. "Your Honor, I strongly object to this entire procedure. This is a custody hearing, not a criminal proceeding. My client's constitutional rights are being violated. This evidence is irrelevant to the matter at hand." "Your Honor," Officer Martinez interrupted respectfully but firmly, "the evidence is highly relevant. The investigation began 3 weeks ago when we received a report through our tip line. We've been conducting surveillance since then, and we've obtained this warrant based on probable cause that Mr. Davis is engaged in illegal activity. The warrant covers his vehicle, his person, and any evidence stored in this building or his residence." Duke, sensing the tension and the presence of potential evidence, had begun to shift his weight, his keen nose working the air. The dog was exhibiting the early stages of alert behavior, his instincts telling him that something significant was nearby. Judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, as if the gesture could somehow clarify the shocking reality she was now facing. "Officer Martinez, you'll conduct your search. Court is in recess. Everyone remain in their seats until further notice." Sarah held Emma close, her mind spinning with questions, fears, and a growing sense of horrible clarity. Everything was about to change. The courtroom had descended into controlled chaos. Judge had instructed everyone to remain seated, while Officer Martinez and Duke prepared to conduct their search of the evidence room adjacent to the courtroom. Court officers had been positioned at all exits, creating an atmosphere of containment and restriction. Most people were whispering urgently to one another, processing the shocking revelation that had just been delivered. The air itself seemed to have changed. What had been a routine custody hearing had transformed into something far darker, far more consequential. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her arms still wrapped protectively around Emma. Her mind was racing, attempting to process the implications of what she had just heard. Child exploitation material. The words kept repeating in her head like a broken record, each repetition bringing fresh waves of nausea and horror. She looked at Daniel, who sat slumped in his chair, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear with obvious frustration and concern. Daniel's entire body language had changed. The composed, confident demeanor he had maintained throughout the custody hearing had evaporated completely. He looked like a man whose world was collapsing. Emma had quieted after her initial whimper, but she remained tense and alert. She was sitting very still on Sarah's lap now, Mr. Floppy held against her chest with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes were darting around the courtroom, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in atmosphere. 3-year-olds were remarkably perceptive despite their limited understanding of complex situations. Emma could sense the fear, the anger, the the confusion radiating from the adults around her. She could feel her mother's body trembling slightly, could sense the tension in Sarah's grip. But she remained relatively quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, something that required her to be small and unobtrusive. Officer Martinez had begun to move toward the evidence room with Duke, accompanied by 2 additional police officers who had arrived separately. Judge watched them go, her expression troubled and deeply concerned. Richard was making frantic notes, no doubt planning legal arguments and constitutional challenges. Sarah's attorney, a woman named Lansing, was leaning toward Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and shock on her face. "Did you know anything about this?" whispered. Sarah shook her head, unable to find words. She had suspected something was wrong, had sensed that Daniel was hiding something, but she had never imagined anything like this. The scope of what was being implied was almost too enormous to comprehend. Officer Martinez and Duke were now passing through the courtroom, heading toward the evidence room. This was the moment that everything changed. This was the instant when a 3-year-old child, through a combination of intuition, trauma response, and something scientists still didn't fully understand, would set in motion a chain of events that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Emma suddenly went rigid. Every muscle in her small body tensed simultaneously. She sat up straight, her eyes going wide. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Sarah, who had learned her daughter's behavioral patterns intimately over 3 years, immediately recognized that something had shifted dramatically. "Emma, honey, are you okay?" Sarah asked, concern flooding her voice. But Emma was not responding to her mother. Every ounce of Emma's attention was focused on Duke. The police dog was walking past them, following Officer Martinez toward the evidence room. Duke was a magnificent animal, trained and professional, his demeanor calm and controlled. For most people, Duke would be an impressive sight. But for Emma, Duke represented something far more profound, far more significant. Something that her 3-year-old brain had been trained, through trauma and fear and painful experience, to recognize. Emma suddenly stood up in her chair, not gradually, not hesitantly, but with sudden, startling urgency. Her entire body was trembling. "Mommy, no," she said, her voice taking on a panicked quality that made Sarah's heart lurch. "No, no, no." Sarah tried gently to pull Emma back down. She was embarrassed by the disruption, concerned about Emma's sudden distress. "Emma, sweetie, sit down. Everything's okay. Just sit down and be quiet." But Emma resisted with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small child. She pulled away from her mother's gentle restraint. "No, Mommy. No, Mommy, look at the dog." The courtroom, which had been filled with quiet murmuring and nervous activity, began to quiet. Several people turned to look at the small child who was now standing in her chair, pointing with intense focus at Duke. The judge looked up from her paperwork. The social workers exchanged glances. Emma's grandmother, sitting behind them, leaned forward with concern. Even Daniel looked up, his expression shifting from despair to confusion as he registered his daughter's distress. Officer Martinez had paused. Duke, ever attuned to emotional shifts in his environment, had also stopped. The dog's ears had perked up, his highly trained senses detecting something in Emma's emotional response that warranted attention. Police dogs were trained to recognize human stress responses, to understand when something significant was happening. Duke's body language changed subtly. His alert status increased. Emma was pointing directly at Duke, her tiny finger extended with unwavering focus. But there was something about her demeanor that was profoundly different from a child simply excited to see a dog. This wasn't the reaction of a toddler enthusiastic about an animal. This was the reaction of a child experiencing profound fear mixed with confused recognition. This was the response of a traumatized child responding to a trigger. "Bad man," Emma said suddenly, her voice cutting through the courtroom with surprising clarity and force. The words were simple, spoken in a child's voice, but they fell on the courtroom like thunder. "Bad man. Mommy, bad man." Sarah felt her blood go cold. "Emma, what do you mean? That's a police dog, that's a good dog." "Bad man," Emma repeated more urgently now. "Bad man, he hurt Emma, bad man hurt Emma." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Not a whisper, not a shuffle of papers. Complete, profound silence. Everyone was staring at the small child standing in her chair, pointing at the police dog, her voice becoming increasingly frantic and distressed. Judge had sat back in her chair, her eyes widening. Lansing had grabbed Sarah's arm. Sarah's mother had her hand over her mouth. The social workers were leaning toward each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. Officer Martinez had turned around completely, his professional eyes now focused intently on Emma rather than on the task at hand. Duke sensed the shift in emotional intensity and had shifted into a more alert posture, his body language reflecting the heightened stress in the environment. But it was Daniel's reaction that was most telling. He had gone even paler, if such a thing was possible. His entire body had begun to shake visibly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but his attorney grabbed him by the collar and yanked him down, hissing something urgently in his ear. Richard's face had gone ashen. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead. "Bad man, Emma continued, her fear escalating. "Dark room, bad man in dark room, he hurt Emma, he put Emma on the floor, bad man said don't tell." The implications of the child's words were devastating and impossible to misinterpret. The courtroom, which moments ago had been processing the revelation of a criminal investigation, was now faced with something far more immediate and horrifying. A 3-year-old was describing abuse. A 3-year-old was identifying her abuser. And everyone in the courtroom was witnessing the moment of revelation. Sarah pulled Emma down from the chair and held her daughter, feeling her entire body shake with sobs. Emma was crying now, traumatized by the intensity of her own emotional reaction, confused about why the memory had surged forward with such violence. But she had spoken the truth. Somehow, through some combination of instinct and trauma response and a 3-year-old's remarkable capacity for honesty, Emma had revealed the darkest secret in the courtroom. Judge was already reaching for her phone. Officer Martinez was speaking urgently into his radio. The courtroom was transitioning from a legal proceeding into a child protection emergency. Everything was about to change irrevocably. The moment Emma's voice rang out with those 2 devastating words, "bad man," it was as if someone had thrown a switch that transformed the entire energy of the courtroom. What had been a tense but relatively controlled environment instantly erupted into absolute chaos. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the shocking impact of a 3-year-old child's honest testimony, unfiltered by the social conventions and legal strategies that adults use to obscure truth. "Bad man," Emma continued, her voice rising in pitch and intensity. "Bad man, he hurt Emma, dark room, bad man in dark room." Sarah felt her world beginning to spin. She pulled Emma down from the chair and held her daughter against her chest, her own body beginning to shake involuntarily. Emma was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that racked her tiny frame. But beyond her daughter's physical distress, Sarah was processing the implications of what Emma was saying. The fragmented phrases, the way Emma referred to herself in third person as traumatized children often do, the specific mention of a dark room, it all pointed to a horror that Sarah's mind had been trying to protect her from fully comprehending. "He put Emma on the floor. Bad man said don't tell. He touched Emma, bad man's hands." Emma's words tumbled out in a cascade of trauma, each phrase more devastating than the last. The child's innocence was visible in her inability to fully articulate what had happened, in the gaps and confusions in her account. But the emotional truth underlying the fragmented words was undeniable and horrifying. Judge had stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. All pretense of judicial calm had evaporated. "Officer Martinez, secure this child immediately. This is now a documented abuse disclosure. We need to preserve everything she said. "Bailey, get Child Protective Services on the phone right now." Her voice, which had been measured and controlled throughout the hearing, was now sharp with urgent authority. The courtroom erupted into frantic activity. Court officers moved into action. Social workers were already pulling out their phones, aware that they were now witnesses to a critical child abuse disclosure that would trigger mandatory reporting protocols. One of the social workers, a woman named Tors who had been observing the custody hearing, immediately began taking detailed notes, documenting everything Emma was saying. The words spoken by a child in a courtroom, before a judge and multiple witnesses, would carry significant legal weight. Daniel attempted to stand. His face had transformed from pale to a sickly grayish color. He was struggling to find words, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish pulled from water. I didn't. That's not," he stammered incoherently. But before he could form any coherent defense, his attorney, Richard, grabbed him forcefully and yanked him back into his seat. "Don't you say another word," hissed urgently, his voice low but intense. "Not one single word. Do you understand me? Nothing. You don't speak to anyone without me present." But even as spoke, his own face was ashen. He was a skilled defense attorney, but even he could recognize the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The admission of guilt was written across Daniel's entire being, in his frozen expression, in his inability to form coherent words, in the way his entire body had begun to shake with barely suppressed panic. Officer Martinez had moved immediately to Sarah and Emma. He spoke in a calm, professional voice, his years of training enabling him to maintain composure in a crisis. "Ma'am, I'm Officer James Martinez with the Cleveland Police Department. I need to document what your daughter just said. This is a critical disclosure, and we need to treat it with the utmost care and professionalism." Sarah was barely hearing him. She was focused entirely on Emma, whispering soothing words to her daughter, holding her close, silently apologizing for not protecting her from whatever horrors had occurred. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. You're safe. You're safe now." Lansing, Sarah's attorney, had moved to stand beside her client protectively. "Your Honor, I'm requesting immediate protective custody for the child. This disclosure clearly indicates an unsafe situation. The child should be removed from the father's custody indefinitely, pending investigation." "Agreed," Judge said without hesitation. She was already making notes on the case file. Her entire focus now shifted from custody determination to child protection. "Daniel Davis is hereby all custody and visitation rights pending investigation into the allegations of child abuse. The child remains in the custody of Sarah Mitchell. Officer Martinez, I'm authorizing you to conduct whatever investigation you deem necessary." Daniel suddenly lunged to his feet, his composure completely shattered. No, I didn't do anything. She's lying. The child is confused. She's been coached. Sarah coached her to say these things." His voice was rising to a shout, desperation evident in every syllable. "I would never hurt my daughter. Never. This is a setup. This is." "Bailiff, remove the defendant from the courtroom," Judge commanded, her voice cutting through Daniel's protests like a knife. "He's clearly agitated and potentially a threat. Place him in custody pending arraignment on the charges related to the search warrant." Immediately, 2 court officers moved toward Daniel. He tried to resist, his arms flailing. No, you don't understand. Sarah set this up. The child doesn't understand. She's confused. Emma, honey, tell them Daddy didn't hurt you. Tell them." Emma, hearing her father's voice, began crying even harder. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trembling violently. The sound of her father's voice, coupled with the reality of what was happening, had triggered another wave of trauma response in the child. Sarah held her daughter, silently comforting her while simultaneously trying to shield her from the terrible scene unfolding around them. The court officers physically removed Daniel from the courtroom. He continued protesting, his voice growing fainter as he was escorted out. Richard followed behind, his face the picture of professional concern masked poorly over personal distress. The expensive attorney was already calculating the legal nightmare his client now faced. This case had just transformed from a potential search warrant investigation into a full-fledged child abuse case, with documented disclosure before a judge and multiple witnesses. Once Daniel had been removed, a profound silence descended over the courtroom. The emotional weight of what had just transpired seemed to press down on everyone present. Judge removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, processing the shocking turn of events. The social workers were all taking detailed notes. Officer Martinez was speaking quietly into his radio, updating other officers about the disclosure. Lansing placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. Torres, the social worker, approached Sarah and Emma carefully. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Torres with the Ohio Department of Children and Family Services. I need to conduct a more detailed interview with Emma, but not right now. Right now, she needs you. She needs safety and comfort. We'll arrange a formal forensic interview at the Children's Advocacy Center, where trained professionals can document her statement properly." Sarah nodded numbly. She was running on emotional fumes, barely processing anything beyond the reality that her daughter had been abused by the man she had married, the man she had trusted with their child's safety. The guilt was already beginning to set in, the terrible, crushing guilt of a parent who had failed to protect her child from danger that had been lurking in her own home. Judge called for a brief recess. She instructed the bailiff to ensure that Sarah and Emma were escorted to a private room where they could have some peace and privacy. Additional officers were stationed outside to ensure Daniel could not approach them. The courtroom, which had been the site of a routine custody hearing just moments before, had transformed into a crime scene of sorts, not physically, but emotionally and legally significant. As Sarah was escorted from the courtroom with Emma still clinging to her, she looked back at the empty chair where Daniel had been sitting. The reality of what had been hidden, what had been revealed, and what would now unfold in the legal system seemed almost too enormous to comprehend. But one thing was absolutely certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Emma had spoken. The truth had been revealed, and the consequences would ripple outward, affecting everyone involved for years to come. The private room where Sarah and Emma had been escorted was a stark contrast to the formal courtroom they had just left. It was designed specifically for vulnerable witnesses and traumatized children. Soft carpet, gentle lighting, comfortable furniture, arranged in a way that felt less institutional and more like a safe space. A child psychologist named Doctor had been called to the courthouse and arrived within 30 minutes of Emma's disclosure. She was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and years of experience working with traumatized children. She understood the delicate balance between gathering information and protecting a child's emotional. Sarah sat on a soft cushioned chair with Emma curled against her chest, still crying but beginning to show signs of emotional exhaustion. The child's body had gone limp, as if the effort of articulating her trauma had drained every ounce of energy from her small frame. Mr. Floppy, the stuffed rabbit, had never left Emma's grasp. The toy had become a physical manifestation of safety and continuity in a world that had become chaotic and dangerous. Doctor entered quietly, moving with deliberate slowness. She had learned through years of experience that sudden movements or loud voices could trigger additional trauma responses in children who had recently disclosed abuse. "Hello, Sarah." "And hello, Emma," she said gently, her voice soft and warm. "I'm Doctor. I'm here to help you, and I want to make sure you're both safe and comfortable. Emma has been very brave today, very brave indeed." Sarah looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She hadn't cried exactly. She was still in shock, still processing, still in that strange liminal space between denial and acceptance that parents often inhabited when confronted with evidence of abuse. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Doctor said, settling into a chair positioned at a comfortable distance that didn't feel threatening or intrusive, "we're going to take some time for Emma to rest. But later today, and over the coming days, trained professionals will conduct what we call a forensic interview with Emma. This is a specially designed interview process that helps us understand what happened while also protecting Emma's safety and emotional. Officer Martinez entered the room, accompanied by Detective Sarah, a woman who had spent the last 15 years specializing in child abuse investigations. Detective had the bearing of someone who had seen humanity's darkest side and had developed a resilient compassion in response. She understood the systemic failures that often preceded abuse disclosures, the missed signs, the ignored warnings, the perpetrators who exploited the system's blind spots. "Ms. Mitchell," Detective began, speaking in respectful but professional tones, "I'm Detective Sarah with the Cleveland Police Department's Special Victims Unit. I need to inform you of several things. First, based on your daughter's disclosure before the judge and multiple witnesses, we are opening a formal investigation into Daniel Davis for child sexual abuse. Second, we have probable cause to execute search warrants on his home, vehicle, and workplace. Third, we're coordinating with the prosecutor's office, and Mr. Davis will likely be facing serious felony charges pending the results of our investigation." Sarah felt the room beginning to spin. The words made sense individually, but their cumulative weight was almost impossible to bear. Her husband, the man she had married, the man she had shared a bed with, the man she had trusted with their daughter's care, had abused their child. The reality of this fact kept trying to force its way into her consciousness, and she kept trying to push it back out because acknowledging it fully seemed like it would destroy her. "What happens to Emma?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Will she have to testify? Will she have to see him? Will she have to go through a trial?" Detective's expression softened. She had answered these questions many times before, and each time she understood the desperate hope in a parent's voice that somehow their child could be spared additional trauma. "We'll do everything we can to minimize Emma's exposure to the legal process. Typically, children her age don't testify in open court. Instead, we use a combination of her recorded forensic interview, physical evidence, and digital evidence when available. But I won't lie to you, prosecution in these cases is complicated, especially when the victim is very young." While this conversation was unfolding in the private room, other events were happening simultaneously throughout the courthouse and beyond. Officer Martinez had obtained the necessary search warrants and had organized teams to conduct simultaneous searches of Daniel Davis's home, his vehicle, and his workplace. These were not casual searches. They were coordinated, professional, and specifically designed to preserve evidence in a way that would be admissible in court. At Daniel's residence, a modest two-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood of Cleveland, officers were photographing every room, cataloging every item, looking for anything that might indicate child abuse or exploitation. They discovered a locked drawer in his bedroom closet. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were several items that made the officers' blood run cold. Photographs, explicit photographs of children, multiple children. Some of the children in the photographs appeared to be extremely young, younger than Emma. Officer Martinez received word of the discovery via radio and felt the weight of the case shift. This was no longer just about Daniel's abuse of his daughter. This was now part of a potentially larger network, a larger criminal enterprise. He immediately contacted the FBI's Crimes Against Children Task Force and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What had begun as a local investigation was now expanding into something far more significant and systemic. At Daniel's workplace, a marketing firm in downtown Cleveland, officers discovered that he had access to a private office with a personal computer. When they obtained the passwords and examined the computer's hard drive, they discovered a horrifying digital archive. Thousands of images and videos of child sexual abuse material downloaded and organized in hidden folders. The timestamps on some of the files indicated they span years, suggesting a long-standing pattern of behavior, a deliberate choice to seek out and consume content depicting the sexual exploitation of children. Back in the courtroom, Judge was being briefed on these discoveries by Officer Martinez and Detective. The judge's face grew increasingly grave as she learned the extent and scope of Daniel's criminal activity. "This is more extensive than we initially anticipated," Judge said, her judicial composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine horror at what was being revealed. Torres, the social worker, was conducting a more detailed interview with Emma, carefully and gently asking open-ended questions that allowed the child to share what she remembered without suggesting specific information. Emma's responses were fragmented and confused in places, but they painted a picture of repeated incidents over a period of months. There were references to a dark room in the basement, to being told to keep secrets, to feeling scared and confused. The child's descriptions were precise enough to be credible, while remaining vague enough to reflect a 3-year-old's incomplete understanding of what was happening to her. Doctor, observing the interview, was taking detailed clinical notes. From a psychological perspective, Emma was displaying classic signs of child sexual abuse trauma. The regression to thumb-sucking that she hadn't done in over a year, the acute anxiety response when her father's name was mentioned, the dissociative episodes where she seemed to retreat into herself, the fragmented and sometimes incoherent nature of her disclosure, all of it pointed to genuine trauma rather than false accusation. By the end of the day, multiple investigations were simultaneously. The local police investigation was expanding. The FBI was becoming involved. The prosecutor's office was beginning to build a case. Child Protective Services was coordinating Emma's care and therapy. Forensic evidence was being collected and preserved. Digital evidence was being analyzed by computer forensics specialists. And at the center of all this activity was a 3-year-old girl who had mustered the courage, through some combination of trauma response and intuitive recognition, to speak a truth that adults had failed to protect her from. Her 2 words "bad man" had set in motion a cascade of events that would eventually expose not just one perpetrator, but potentially a larger network of exploitation. The investigation was only beginning, but already it was clear that Daniel Davis's worst fears were being realized. The darkness he had tried to keep hidden was being illuminated by the harsh light of justice. The interrogation room at the Cleveland Police Department was deliberately designed to be psychologically uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting, plain gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, uncomfortable metal chairs. There was no window, no clock, nothing to provide a sense of time or escape. Daniel Davis sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed, his expensive suit now rumpled and stained with sweat. His earlier denials and protests had given way to a kind of resigned silence. His attorney, Richard, sat beside him, his face a mixture of professional detachment and personal disgust. Detective Sarah entered the room with a thick file folder. She had been doing this work for 15 years, and she had learned to separate her personal revulsion from her professional demeanor. She needed to get Daniel to talk, to provide details that would help them understand the extent of his criminal network and potentially identify other victims. She set the folder down on the table deliberately, letting it make a sharp sound that made Daniel flinch. "Mr. Davis," Detective began, her voice calm and measured, "we've obtained the results from the searches executed at your residence, vehicle, and workplace. We've also begun the digital forensics on your computer. I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell your side of the story before we go through all of this evidence systematically. That's your choice, of course, but I'd strongly recommend cooperation." Daniel's face was gray, almost corpse-like. He looked like a man whose entire world had collapsed, which in fact it had. His carefully constructed life, the respectable job, the suburban home, the appearance of normalcy, had all been a facade hiding a dark psychological pathology. Richard leaned toward him, whispering something urgently. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I want to talk," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to explain." "Daniel, I strongly advise against," began, but Daniel held up his hand. "I don't care," Daniel said, looking directly at Detective. "I'm done. I'm done lying. I'm done pretending. I'm done." What followed over the next several hours was a confession that painted a picture of systematic abuse, calculated manipulation, and a deep psychological pathology that Daniel himself claimed he didn't fully understand. He described how the abuse of Emma had begun gradually, escalating over months. He described how he had deliberately created situations where he would be alone with her, how he had groomed her by slowly introducing inappropriate touching, how he had told her it was a special game that she shouldn't tell anyone about. "Why?" Detective asked, her professional composure barely masking her internal horror. "Why would you do this to your own daughter?" Daniel's response was chilling in its matter-of-fact quality. He described a long-standing attraction to children that he claimed had begun in his own childhood. He described how he had been abused by an older cousin when he was 7 years old, how that trauma had twisted his developing sexuality in ways he claimed he couldn't control. He described how the consumption of child exploitation material had become an obsession, how the line between fantasy and reality had become increasingly blurred until he had crossed it with his own daughter. "I knew it was wrong," he said, his voice hollow and emotionless. "Part of me always knew it was wrong, but another part of me couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop wanting it." Detective documented everything, her expression remaining professionally neutral even as her internal moral compass was being severely tested. She had learned not to judge, to remain objective, to focus on gathering information that would help protect other children and build an unassailable prosecution case. As the digital forensics team continued their analysis of Daniel's computer, they began to uncover something even more sinister. The photographs and videos found on his hard drive weren't just passively collected. Daniel had connections to an online network of individuals engaged in child exploitation. There were encrypted communications with other perpetrators, discussions about where to find exploitative material, recommendations for websites. But more disturbingly, there was evidence suggesting Daniel had participated in the production of at least some of the material. FBI Special Agent Wellington, who had joined the investigation, briefed Detective on the scope of what they were uncovering. "We've identified at least 47 distinct children featured in the material on his computer. Some of them appear multiple times. We're cross-referencing with our national database of child exploitation victims. We've already identified 5 children who were previously unknown to law enforcement. We're reaching out to local authorities in those jurisdictions to determine if there are additional victims." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. What had begun as a single perpetrator case was now being understood as part of a larger network of exploitation. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was coordinating with international authorities. Interpol was being contacted. The scope was expanding exponentially. Meanwhile, at the Children's Advocacy Center, Emma was undergoing her forensic interview. Conducted by a specially trained interviewer named Michael Torres, the interview was videotaped from multiple angles and audio recorded. Michael had been doing this work for 8 years, and he had developed an almost preternatural ability to communicate with traumatized children in ways that elicited truthful information without suggesting details or leading the child toward predetermined conclusions. "Emma," Michael said gently, "I want to ask you about when your daddy did things that made you feel unsafe. Can you tell me about that?" Emma, sitting next to a social worker in a room decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture, clutched Mr. Floppy and began to speak. Her account was fragmented, confused in places, but it was also remarkably consistent with what she had revealed in the courtroom. She described specific incidents. She described the dark room, which investigators later determined was Daniel's basement office where he kept his computer, and the locked drawer containing exploitation material. She described being told to keep secrets. She described fear and confusion and pain. Doctor, watching from the observation room, took careful clinical notes. From a psychological perspective, Emma's account demonstrated remarkable consistency with genuine child sexual abuse trauma. She wasn't providing the kind of detailed, organized narrative that a coached or suggestible child might produce. Instead, she was offering the fragmented, emotionally raw account of a very young child trying to articulate experiences that were far too complex for her cognitive development to fully process. Back at the police station, additional search warrants were being executed based on the information Daniel was providing and the digital evidence being uncovered. Officers were visiting the residences and workplaces of known associates in the online exploitation network. Arrests were being made. Computers were being seized. The investigation was expanding like ripples in a pond, each revelation leading to new discoveries, each new discovery leading to more investigations. Prosecutor Mitchell held a press conference announcing the charges against Daniel Davis. Mr. Davis is facing 23 felony counts, including child sexual abuse, possession of child sexual abuse material, production of child sexual abuse material, and trafficking. We are coordinating with federal authorities and law enforcement agencies in multiple states. This investigation has uncovered evidence of a significant child exploitation network. We are committed to pursuing every possible lead and holding every perpetrator accountable. The media began to descend on the story. National news outlets picked up on the unusual circumstances: a custody hearing interrupted by a police dog investigation, a 3-year-old's testimony leading to the uncovering of a child exploitation network. It became one of those rare cases that captured public attention and sparked broader conversations about child protection systems, about the importance of listening to children, about the systemic failures that sometimes allowed predators to operate with relative impunity. For Sarah, watching this unfold was a complex emotional experience. There was relief that her daughter's abuser had been apprehended and was facing serious consequences. There was pride in Emma's courage in speaking the truth, even though Emma didn't fully understand what she was accomplishing. But there was also profound guilt and trauma. Sarah found herself constantly replaying moments she had missed, signs she should have recognized, times when she had trusted Daniel with Emma's care, and Emma had been suffering in silence. Emma, for her part, began a long process of trauma therapy. Her young mind, while remarkably resilient, had been damaged by the experiences she had endured. Doctor established a treatment plan designed to help Emma process her trauma, to rebuild her sense of safety, to help her understand that what happened was not her fault, that she had been brave, that she was safe now. The case against Daniel Davis was being carefully constructed, piece by piece, evidence by evidence. What had been hidden in darkness was now being dragged into the light, examined, documented, and prepared for prosecution. The hidden truth was no longer hidden, and the truth was more extensive, more systematic, and more horrifying than anyone had initially suspected. But it was also a truth that would ultimately protect other children, that would expose a criminal network, that would bring justice for multiple victims. All because a 3-year-old girl had the courage to speak 2 words that shattered everything. The courtroom was packed, not just with the usual legal personnel and interested parties, but with journalists, victim advocates, and law enforcement officials. The case had attracted significant public attention. The story of a 3-year-old girl whose words had unraveled a criminal exploitation network had captured something in the public imagination, a narrative of courage, protection, and justice that transcended the typical legal proceedings. Daniel Davis stood before Judge, his appearance a stark contrast to the confident man who had entered the courthouse weeks earlier. He looked diminished, aged by stress and the weight of impending consequences. His expensive suits had been replaced with an orange prison jumpsuit. His attorney, Richard, stood beside him with a resigned expression. Had negotiated extensively with the prosecutor, and a plea deal had been reached. Daniel would plead guilty to 17 felony counts, including child sexual abuse, possession of child sexual abuse material, and production of child sexual abuse material. In exchange, the prosecution would not pursue an additional 18 counts, and they would recommend a sentence of 25 to 30 years. Judge reviewed the plea agreement with meticulous care. She had read the psychiatric evaluations. She had reviewed the evidence. She had considered victim impact statements, including one submitted by Sarah on behalf of Emma. The judge understood the weight of this moment. Daniel Davis represented not just an individual perpetrator, but a systemic failure of protection systems, a manifestation of predatory behavior that had remained hidden behind the facade of respectability. "Mr. Davis," Judge said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "you have agreed to plead guilty to these charges. Before I accept your plea, I need to confirm your understanding. You are aware that by pleading guilty, you are giving up your right to trial, your right to confront witnesses, and your right to appeal based on claims of innocence." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. He had gone pale, as if the reality of his impending imprisonment was finally becoming concrete in his consciousness. "And you are entering this plea freely and voluntarily, without coercion?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge nodded slowly. "The court accepts your guilty plea. Now, before I impose sentencing, I would like to hear from the victim's representative." Sarah Mitchell stood. She had prepared a statement for weeks, working with a victim advocate to articulate the impact of Daniel's crimes on her daughter and herself. Her hands trembled as she held the paper, but her voice was steady and clear as she spoke. "Your Honor, my daughter was 3 years old when she became a victim of systematic abuse by the man she should have been able to trust most in the world. Emma did not understand what was happening to her. She could not protect herself. She could not articulate her experience with the precision that would normally be expected in a court of law. But she found the courage to speak, and her words changed everything." Sarah's voice began to crack with emotion. "Emma will carry the scars of this abuse for the rest of her life. She will need years of therapy to process what happened to her. She will likely struggle with issues of trust and safety and autonomy for many years to come. The damage done to my daughter is not something that can be measured in a courtroom or fully articulated in words. It is a profound violation of her childhood, her innocence, and her sense of safety." She paused, gathering herself. "But I also want to say something to Emma and to other children who may be listening to this case. Emma, you were brave. You were incredibly brave. What happened to you was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. You spoke the truth, and that truth protected you and helped protect other children. I want you to know that you are safe now. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you are safe." There was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the seasoned law enforcement officers and prosecutors were visibly affected. Judge then addressed Daniel directly. "Mr. Davis, you have caused immeasurable harm. You have violated a child entrusted to your care. You have participated in a criminal network that exploits and damages children. You have demonstrated a complete absence of remorse or accountability for your actions." She paused, letting the silence settle. "I am sentencing you to 28 years in the federal penitentiary, to be followed by 15 years of supervised release. Additionally, you are required to register as a sex offender for the remainder of your life. You are prohibited from any contact with your daughter. You are prohibited from possessing or accessing any material depicting minors. And you are required to undergo psychological treatment while incarcerated." Judge struck her gavel. "The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending transfer to the federal prison system. This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Some people nodded with grim satisfaction. Others wept. Daniel was led away by marshals, his head down, his walk shuffling, looking like a man whose entire world had definitively ended. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Mitchell held a press conference. "Today, justice was served. Daniel Davis has been held accountable for his crimes, But this case represents something larger than a single perpetrator. This case represents a network of exploitation that we have been working to dismantle. Over the course of this investigation, we have identified multiple victims and multiple perpetrators. We have coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country and internationally. We have made arrests in 7 states and 3 foreign countries. She paused, looking directly at the cameras. We want to acknowledge the courage of Emma Davis. A 3-year-old girl spoke the truth, and that truth protected her and countless other children. We also want to acknowledge the importance of listening to children, believing children, and protecting children. The systems that failed to recognize the signs of Emma's abuse have been examined, and modifications have been recommended. We are committed to ensuring that future abuse is detected and reported early. For Emma, the legal proceedings were largely abstract. She didn't fully understand what had happened in the courtroom or why her father had been taken away. But what she did understand was that she was safe. She understood that her mother was protecting her. She understood that the frightening man who had hurt her was no longer present in her life. Emma began intensive therapy with Dr. twice weekly. The therapy involved play-based interventions, art therapy, and careful trauma processing. Doctor worked to help Emma understand that what had happened was not her fault, that her body belonged to her, that she had the right to say no to inappropriate touch. The work was delicate, careful, designed not to re-traumatize, but to help Emma gradually process and integrate the trauma into her developing sense of self. Child Protective Services conducted an investigation into how the abuse had occurred without detection. They examined the initial custody evaluation process, the home visits, the social worker reports. The findings were sobering. There had been missed signs. There had been moments when the system could have intervened but had failed to do so. Recommendations were made for improved training, better screening protocols, more frequent home visits in contested custody cases, and more thorough background investigations. Judge issued an order requiring that all custody evaluations in the jurisdiction include more comprehensive background checks and screening for history of sexual offenses. She also mandated that all social workers receive additional training in recognizing signs of child sexual abuse. While these changes couldn't undo the harm that had been done to Emma, they represented systemic improvements that might prevent similar cases in the future. Sarah, in the weeks following the sentencing, found herself gradually emerging from the immediate crisis phase. She still experienced moments of crushing guilt, still found herself replaying events and wondering if there were signs she had missed. But she was also beginning to understand that Daniel's crimes were his responsibility, not hers. She had done the best she could with the information she had at the time. And ultimately, her trust in her daughter's words, her willingness to pursue custody, her advocacy for protection had made all the difference. Emma's life was gradually beginning to normalize. She still had difficult days, still experienced anxiety and fear. But she was also laughing again. She was playing with other children. She was developing a sense of safety within the protective boundaries her mother had created. The scars would remain, but they were scars of survival, evidence of a child who had endured trauma and was learning to live beyond it. The case against Daniel Davis had resulted in his incarceration and protective custody of Emma. But more broadly, it had exposed a criminal network, led to additional arrests, and sparked important conversations about child protection. All of it traced back to a 3-year-old girl's courage and a police dog's trained instinct. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. 6 months had passed since Daniel Davis's sentencing. The Ohio autumn had given way to spring, and the world had its seasonal transformation. But for Emma, the transformation was far more profound than the changing of seasons. The 4-year-old girl played freely in the backyard of her mother's home, her laughter echoing across the grass in a way that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Sarah stood on the porch, watching her daughter with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Emma wore a bright yellow sundress with small white daisies, and she was chasing butterflies that fluttered lazily through the flowering garden. Mr. Floppy, the worn stuffed rabbit, was no longer constantly clutched against Emma's chest. Instead, it sat on a shelf in her bedroom, still cherished but no longer needed as an emotional anchor for survival. The journey from that devastating courtroom moment to this peaceful backyard scene had not been linear or easy. It had been filled with setbacks and breakthroughs, with difficult days and gradually accumulating good days. Doctor continued to meet with Emma twice weekly for therapy sessions. These sessions had evolved significantly over the 6 months. Early sessions had focused on emotional stabilization and safety. But gradually, as Emma's nervous system had begun to regulate, the therapy had shifted toward processing the trauma and rebuilding Emma's sense of bodily autonomy and self-worth. During one recent session, Emma had drawn a picture of herself with a big heart surrounded by protective circles. When Doctor asked her what the circles meant, Emma had said simply, "Mommy keeps me safe. You help me feel better. Officer Martinez's dog helped me tell the truth." Even a 4-year-old's understanding of what had happened was beginning to take shape, integrated into a narrative of protection and courage rather than victimization and shame. The relationship between Sarah and Emma had deepened in ways that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Sarah had become hypervigilant about Emma's safety, a tendency that Doctor had helped her moderate through her own therapy sessions. Sarah was working with a therapist herself, processing her own trauma as a mother who had failed to protect her child, working through the guilt and the anger and the grief. But she was also learning to forgive herself, to understand that she had done the best she could with the information she had at the time, and that ultimately her instinct to protect Emma had been correct. Officer James Martinez had become an unexpected but important figure in Emma's recovery process. What had begun as a professional investigation had transformed into something more personal. Officer Martinez understood the importance of rebuilding Emma's sense of safety around law enforcement. With Doctor's guidance, Officer Martinez had begun bringing Duke, the police dog, to Emma's therapy sessions. Initially, Emma had exhibited significant anxiety around Duke, the trigger associated with her disclosure and all the traumatic events that had followed. But gradually, through careful, patient interaction, Emma had begun to develop a new relationship with the dog. Duke had been trained in therapeutic work and had become remarkably gentle and responsive to Emma's needs. During therapy sessions, Emma would sit next to Duke, sometimes talking to the dog rather than directly to Doctor. "Duke helped me tell the truth," Emma would say, her small hand resting on the dog's soft fur. "Duke is a good dog. Duke helps people." The dog had become a symbol of safety and protection, a bridge between the traumatic trigger and a new understanding of courage and protection. The broader impact of the case continued to ripple outward. The criminal network investigation had resulted in 23 additional arrests across 5 states and 2 foreign countries. 37 distinct child victims had been identified, and the investigation was still ongoing. Several other perpetrators had received significant prison sentences. Children who had been missing were found safe and reunited with family members or placed in protective custody. Law enforcement agencies across the country had begun studying the case, not just from a prosecutorial standpoint, but also from an educational perspective. Police academies now included the case in their training modules about investigating child abuse. The unusual circumstance of a police dog investigation triggering a child abuse disclosure had fascinated both law enforcement and the academic community. Duke had become something of a celebrity in police training circles, with departments requesting information about his training and his role in the case. Sarah had been approached by several publishing companies and documentary filmmakers interested in telling Emma's story. She had declined most inquiries, wanting to protect Emma's privacy and her healing process. But she had agreed to work with a national child advocacy organization on educational materials about recognizing signs of child abuse and the importance of believing children. She gave occasional interviews about her experience, always careful to maintain Emma's anonymity and privacy, while attempting to raise awareness about child protection systems. Judge had used the case as a catalyst for significant judicial reforms. She had established a task force examining custody evaluation procedures across the state. She had mandated training for all judges hearing custody cases about recognizing indicators of potential child abuse. She had advocated for legislation that would require more comprehensive background checks and screening in contested custody situations. While these reforms couldn't undo the harm done to Emma, they represented systemic changes that would protect other children from similar predatory behavior. Emma's preschool had also significant changes. All staff members had received training on recognizing signs of child abuse and proper reporting procedures. The school had implemented a curriculum component about body safety and appropriate-inappropriate touch. Teachers had been trained to listen carefully to children's disclosures and to take them seriously regardless of how they were articulated. What had occurred in Emma's life had rippled outward to affect child protection practices in her entire school district. In quiet moments, Sarah would reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. The custody hearing that was supposed to determine visitation arrangements had become something infinitely more consequential. The man she had married, who had appeared to be a normal, functioning adult, had been revealed to be a predator. Her 3-year-old daughter had experienced unspeakable violations. But from that darkness had emerged something unexpected: protection, justice, systemic change, and a community of people dedicated to ensuring that Emma and other children would be safer. Emma had begun kindergarten at a new school where she was thriving. Her teachers reported that she was engaged, creative, and developing strong social connections with her peers. She had good days and difficult days. Certain situations could still trigger anxiety: loud noises, unfamiliar men, situations that resembled aspects of her trauma. But Doctor had taught Emma coping strategies, had helped her develop emotional regulation skills that would serve her throughout her life. On a warm spring afternoon, Sarah and Emma sat on the porch swing together, gently rocking back and forth. Emma leaned against her mother, humming a tune she had learned at school. Sarah wrapped her arm around her daughter, breathing in the sweet child scent of her hair, feeling grateful for this moment of peace and normalcy. "Mommy," Emma said suddenly, "I'm going to be a police officer when I grow up. I'm going to have a dog like Duke, and we're going to help people who are scared." Sarah felt tears beginning to flow again. She pulled her daughter closer. "That's a wonderful dream, sweetheart. I think you would be amazing at that." What Emma had experienced was a profound violation of her childhood, a trauma that would likely affect her throughout her life in ways both visible and invisible. But she was also resilient, courageous, and surrounded by people who loved her and were committed to her healing and safety. She was transforming her trauma into purpose, her pain into compassion, her victimization into a determination to protect others. The story that had begun in a courtroom with a 3-year-old's brave words had evolved into something larger, a narrative of justice, protection, systemic change, and most importantly, healing. Emma would carry the scars of her abuse forever, but she would also carry the knowledge that her courage had mattered, that her voice had been heard, that she had set in motion events that had protected not just herself but countless other children. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah and Emma continued to rock gently on the porch swing. A new season was beginning, not just the calendar season, but also a new season in Emma's life. A season of healing, growth, and the slow, patient work of transforming trauma into resilience. The darkness had not ended the story. Instead, it had illuminated the path toward justice and hope. And that ultimately was the real story, not the horror of what had been done, but the extraordinary courage and resilience of a small child who had spoken the truth, and in doing so, had changed everything.